Forced he was to be his mother's husband. The most disturbing case ever revealed in the U.S., this phrase echoed through the corridors of the Louisville court, Kentucky, in March of 1963. It was then that one of the most shocking documented cases of consanguinity in American history came to light from the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where generations of geographical isolation had created closed communities. For over 4 decades, the Harrington family had lived in absolute secret. Our understanding of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what happened on this rural property of 200 acres. Just 16 years old in 1943, Thomas Harrington was forced by his own father, Jeremiah Harrington, to assume marital responsibilities with his mother, Martha, following the patriarch's premature death in a mining accident. What began as a distorted tradition for maintaining a pure lineage turned into the most unimaginable nightmare a family could live. Hidden between centenary oak-covered hills and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to protect its darker secrets was the Harrington property, 15 kilometers from the nearest city, Pineville. There, far from the eyes of society, 3 generations lived under rules created by the family founder, Ezekiel Harrington, who had arrived in the region in 1897 obsessed with preserving what he called blood purity. Having lost her husband in a collapse in the local coal mine, Martha Harrington was 34 in 1943. With 5 children to raise and no financial resources, she found herself trapped by the family traditions imposed by her deceased father-in-law. Chosen to assume the role of family protector was Thomas, the eldest son, a cruel euphemism for what would truly happen over the next 20 years. A shy, blue-eyed boy with brown hair, described by neighbors as such, young Thomas had no choice. An environment where resistance was impossible was created by the social pressures of the time, combined with geographical isolation and financial dependence. A union that violated all known social and moral norms was what he was forced to accept. The family managed to maintain appearances during the early years. While Martha took care of her younger children, Thomas worked the small family farm, cultivating corn and raising some head of cattle. To the few neighbors who occasionally visited, they were merely a mother and son struggling to survive after a family tragedy. But the truth was much more disturbing. Her first child with Thomas had been born to Martha in 1945. A girl, called Sarah, was born with severe facial deformities and learning difficulties. The devastating effects of consanguinity were already indicated by Sarah's physical characteristics: closely set eyes, a cleft palate, and compromised mental development. A boy named David was born in 1947, the second child, who developed chronic breathing problems and frequent seizures. More and more evidently, the effects of endogamy began to manifest itself, yet the family remained isolated, without access to appropriate medical care or external guidance. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Stories that society preferred to forget, but which need to be told to understand the limits of human degradation. By 1950, 7 years after this forced union began, the effects of consanguinity on the Harrington family had become impossible to ignore. 4 children with Thomas had been born to Martha, now 41, each with deformities and health problems more severe than the last. The third child, Michael, was born in 1949, a child who could never walk properly due to malformations in his lower limbs. Its legs were disproportionate to its body, and its feet had fused toes, a condition known as syndactyly, common in cases of close consanguineous relationships. Severe microcephaly was what Rebecca, the 4th child, was born with in 1952. Significantly smaller than normal, her head indicated compromised brain development. She never learned to talk or feed herself, remaining in a vegetative state throughout her brief life of just 8 years. Signs of mental deterioration began to show in Thomas, now 23. The psychological weight of his situation, combined with the pressure to support a family under such adverse conditions, was charging its price. He developed episodes of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of absolute silence and explosions of anger directed at his own children. A scenario of progressive isolation is what the Harrington property had become. The children rarely left the farm, and when they did, they wore hats and clothes that hid their deformed features. A rigid control system had been developed by Martha, prohibiting any interaction with strangers and keeping the children busy with housework to prevent them from exploring beyond the property limits. An unannounced visit to the Harrington farm was made by the local church pastor, Reverend William Patterson, in 1953. He was deeply disturbed by what he found: children with obvious deformities, precarious living conditions, and an environment loaded with tension and fear. While Martha explained the children's conditions as God's will, something in the family's behavior alarmed the religious man. A physical resemblance between Thomas and the younger children was noticed by Reverend Patterson, far more than would be expected in a half-sibling relationship. More intensely appeared the family's characteristic blue eyes, and certain birthmarks were statistically impossible in a normal family. Rebecca had one of her seizures common in children with severe microcephaly during this visit. Though Reverend Patterson offered medical help, Martha refused categorically, claiming doctors wouldn't understand the family's special condition. Even more suspicions about what was truly happening on that isolated property were raised by this refusal. Local church records indicate that Reverend Patterson tried to make more visits in the following months, but he always found the family absent or too busy to receive him. Theories about family curses and divine punishments began to be murmured by the region's religious community about the Harringtons. The fifth child, James, was born in 1954, presenting the most severe set of deformities yet seen in the family. His hands had only 3 fingers each. Heterochromia meant his eyes were different colors, and he developed a cardiac condition that severely limited his physical activities. James rarely cried or showed emotion, remaining in a state of apathy that worried even Martha. A severe drought came to Kentucky in 1958, forcing many rural families to seek government help. Having been able to stay isolated for 15 years, the Harrington family finally had to interact with external authorities when Martha was forced to request food assistance at the Pineville Social Services office. The social worker responsible for the case, Dorothy Mills, a 45-year-old graduate of the University of Louisville, was immediately alert when she first saw the Harrington children. Patterns she had studied in cases of consanguinity during her academic training were consistent with their physical deformities. Dorothy noted that Sarah, now 13, had not only facial deformities but also a characteristic speech pattern of severe intellectual disability. David, 11, breathed with difficulty and had frequent fainting episodes. Michael, 9, needed support to walk, and James, 4, remained completely apathetic throughout the interview. Inconsistencies in the family documents were discovered by Dorothy during the routine investigation to approve social assistance. While the birth records of the youngest children listed Thomas as the father, there was no marriage record for Thomas and any woman. Contradictory and evasive explanations were given by Martha when asked about the children's mother. Unannounced home visits to evaluate the family's living conditions were decided upon by the social worker. She found Thomas and Martha sharing the same room while the 5 children slept in a room without proper ventilation on her first visit in September 1958. A marital relationship between mother and son was clearly suggested by the configuration of the house. When Dorothy confronted Martha about the situation, she received only vehement denials and threats that the family would move if she continued to be persecuted. Yet, the social worker had seen enough to suspect she was facing a case of consanguinity and child neglect. Something even more disturbing was discovered by Dorothy during this investigation. Talking to James, the 4-year-old repeated a phrase he had heard from the adults: "Dad Thomas is Mom Martha's brother." The social worker's suspicions about the true nature of the family relationship were confirmed by this innocent revelation from a child. Asterisk: the moment you hear an innocent child repeat words that reveal the horror of your own existence, you realize that some secrets are too heavy to be buried. Leave a comment telling us which part of this story has impacted you the most so far. Asterisk. Local Sheriff Robert Kane, a 52-year-old man who had served the community for over 2 decades, was immediately contacted by Dorothy Mills. When she shared her discoveries, the sheriff initially showed resistance to believing the severity of the situation. While cases of consanguinity were whispered about in rural communities, they were rarely officially investigated. However, too convincing to be ignored was the evidence presented by Dorothy. A disturbing picture that demanded immediate investigation was painted by the children's deformities combined with the domestic configuration and James's innocent statement. A search warrant to officially investigate the Harrington property was obtained by Sheriff Robert Kane in October 1958. They arrived at the farm on a hazy morning that seemed to mirror the dark atmosphere they would find, accompanied by social worker Dorothy Mills and county doctor Dr. Henry Morrison. Critical to documenting the children's conditions was Dr. Morrison, a graduate of the University of Kentucky School of Medicine with experience in basic genetics. A consistent pattern of congenital malformations he described as textbook examples of inbreeding depression was revealed by his examination. Sarah, now 13, had not only severe facial deformities but also progressive scoliosis that was compromising her respiratory capacity. Dr. Morrison documented that her mental age corresponded approximately to that of a 6-year-old child, and she had developed repetitive behaviors characteristic of autistic spectrum disorders. A congenital cardiac condition that severely limited his life expectancy was diagnosed in David, at age 11. His lungs were underdeveloped, and he had episodes of cyanosis, a bluish skin color indicative of inadequate blood oxygenation. Without medical intervention, Dr. Morrison estimated that David would not live beyond 15 years. So severe were Michael's, at 9 years old, bone malformations that Dr. Morrison recommended multiple surgeries, which were simply not available in Kentucky's rural medicine in 1958. His legs were of different lengths, and his hips were misaligned in a way that caused constant pain. The most complex set of medical problems was had by James, the youngest at 4. In addition to visible physical deformities, Dr. Morrison found that he had mild hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, which explained his extremely limited mental development and constant apathy. Under legal pressure and in the face of irrefutable medical evidence, Martha finally confessed to the true nature of her relationship with Thomas during the investigation. She admitted that after her husband's death in 1943, she had been forced by circumstances and family traditions to maintain a union with her own son. Obvious signs of psychological deterioration were shown by Thomas, now 31. Between periods of lucidity, where he expressed deep remorse for his situation, and episodes of mental confusion, where he seemed not to fully understand what had happened to his life, he alternated during his testimony. That Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, a common consequence of close consanguinity, was also revealed by the investigation. Dr. Morrison estimated that, considering the 5 surviving children, Martha had probably been pregnant at least 10 times, with half of the pregnancies resulting in natural losses due to genetic incompatibilities. Regional attention was gained by the case when Louisville newspapers published stories about Kentucky's most isolated family. Between those who expressed compassion for the family's tragic situation and those who showed revulsion and demanded severe punishment, the local community was divided. The decision to separate the children from their parents was made by the Bell County Court in December 1958. Different care institutions for children with severe disabilities were where Sarah, David, Michael, and James were placed. Rebecca had died 2 years earlier due to complications related to her microcephaly. 15 years in prison for crimes against morals and morality was the sentence given to Thomas Harrington in January 1959, a legal terminology of the time that encompassed incestuous relationships. A 10-year sentence was received by Martha, but due to her status as a victim of circumstance, she served only 4 years in a psychiatric institution. One of the most documented cases of consanguinity in 20th-century American medical literature is what the Harrington fate became. Danville State Hospital was where Sarah was admitted, remaining there until her death in 1967 at age 22 due to respiratory complications related to her congenital deformities. As predicted by Dr. Morrison, David died in 1962 at age 15 during experimental heart surgery at the University of Louisville. Medical studies on the cardiovascular effects of close consanguinity documented his death, contributing to scientific knowledge about endogamy. Until the age of 25, Michael lived, remaining in specialized institutional care. Despite his severe physical limitations, he developed some basic communication skills and showed affection for his caregivers. Kidney complications related to his congenital malformations caused his death in 1974. The youngest, James, surprised doctors by living until he was 31, dying in 1985. Although he never developed mental abilities beyond those of a 3-year-old child, he found some quality of life in a specialized institution where he received appropriate care for the first time in his life. After the family's arrest, the Harrington property was abandoned. The wooden house rapidly deteriorated, and nature began to claim the land that had witnessed so much suffering. Covered by dense vegetation that hides the physical traces of this tragedy, only the stone foundations remain visible today. Social assistance policies in Kentucky were significantly influenced by the Harrington case. A national child rights defender became Dorothy Mills, the social worker who discovered the case, and she helped establish more rigorous protocols for identifying neglect and consanguineous relationships in isolated rural communities. Released from prison in 1967, Thomas was never able to reintegrate into society. He spent his last years in a small boarding house in Louisville, working manual jobs and avoiding social contact. He died in 1983 at the age of 56 from alcohol-related liver cirrhosis, a form of escape he had found to deal with the trauma of his life. After her release in 1963, Martha moved to a small town in Tennessee, where she took on a new identity. She worked as a housekeeper until her retirement and died in 1979, taking her secrets to the grave. She never had contact with any of her surviving children after leaving the psychiatric institution. Important research on the effects of consanguinity in isolated human populations has been contributed to by the Harrington scientific legacy. Early identification protocols for endogamy-related malformations have been helped by medical studies of the children, influencing public health policies in rural communities. A dark reminder of how isolation, distorted traditions, and extreme circumstances can lead whole families into profound degradation, this case remains. The highest possible price for traditions that prioritized blood purity over basic human well-being was paid by the Harrington family. Asterisk if you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Subscribe to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Leave your like if this story has impacted you, and share it so that more people will know these accounts that society preferred to forget, but which need to be told to understand the limits of the human condition. Asterisk.